Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all around the world. My name is Andy Cutchins. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest, and I'll be moderating our discussion today on the topic collateral damage, Central Asia and South Caucasus in the Israeli-Iran conflict. This is the 14th in a series of more or less monthly webinars that we've been hosting at the center as part of the Central Asia Connectivity Project. A couple of our speakers today are veterans of this, and so I will introduce our four speakers, and then we will go in sort of a geographical order of where they are at. But I'll read this alphabetically. Jim Durso is the managing director of Corsair LLC and a frequent commentator on Central Asia and Middle Eastern affairs. He served as a logistics officer in the U.S. Navy with postings in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq. He recently authored in the Diplomat, "The U.S. aimed at Iran, but might have hit Central Asia." You can see where I kind of stole the title from. Roger Kangas is the academic dean and a professor of Central Asian Studies at the Near East South Asia Center, NISA, for Strategic Studies, a regional center of National Defense University. Alaudin Kamilov comes to us from Tashkent, is the head of the International Political Department Project at the Center for Progressive Reforms and an adjunct professor, assistant professor at Webster University in Tashkent. He most recently co-authored in the National Interest, Central Asia, Caught in the Crossfire. Well, another title that I sort of plagiarized from. Highest form of flattery, of course. And our fourth speaker, Damyan Krenyevich-Mishkevich, is professor of practice at ADA University in Baku, the Azerbaijani Diplomatic Academy, Baku, Azerbaijan, where he also serves as director of policy research, analysis, publications at its Institute for Development and Diplomacy. And this is a bit of a homecoming in that at the turn of the century, I like that, he served as managing editor of the National Interest and was also a fellow in European affairs at the Center for the National Interest. Okay, we're going to kind of move geographically from east to west. So we'll start off with Alaudin and then turn to Damyan and then to Jim, and Roger will bat cleanup. All right, Alaudin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy, and many thanks to the Center for the National Interest for organizing this discussion. So today I would like to focus on Central Asia's strategic dilemma in the context of Israel-Iran confrontation and how this crisis is complicating the region's pursuit of strategic autonomy, policy objective that has gained urgency in recent years. Particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the concurrent expansion of Chinese influence across the region. In response to shifting geopolitical ties, the five Central Asian republics have been seeking to achieve strategic autonomy as part of their multi-vector foreign policy. So they work hard to consolidate into regional cooperation and diversify the external partnership, seeking new sources of investment, alternative development financing from the Gulf, EU, Germany, South Korea, without abandoning ties with Moscow and Beijing. But strategic autonomy to a large extent requires access to viable economic corridors. And when we look at the map of Eurasia, it becomes immediately clear. Central Asia is a landlocked region at the heart of Eurasia, surrounded by powerful neighbors such as Russia to the north, China to the east, and Afghanistan, Iran to the south. Among these neighbors, so Iran has emerged as one of the critical gateways in Central Asia's evolving trade and transit architecture in recent years. So there's the international north and south transport corridor, which runs through Iran to Gulf ports and onward to Turkey and Europe, offers Central Asia its shortest and the most cost-effective path to maritime trade and to the global markets. That route has only grown more important as northern corridor through Russia has come under sanctions and scrutiny. So yet the recent military confrontation between Israel and Iran has deeply shaken Central Asia's strategic calculus, creating several paradoxes for the region. So first one is I would call the Gulf paradox. Over the past 2 years, the Gulf cooperation states, especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, have emerged as Central Asia's most dynamic economic partners. They pledged billions in investment across several sectors, such as renewable energy, gas pipeline, agribusiness, and infrastructure. This surge of Gulf capital has raised optimism of replicating or even surpassing China's peak BRI era engagement. Yet, much of this investment and trade are mainly contingent on the infrastructure corridors that pass through Iran. And while GCC states are keen to invest, they remain tightly bound to US security guarantees and are unlikely to jeopardize those alliances by expanding trade or capital flows through Iranian territory during a high-stake confrontation. This creates a strategic bottleneck. For example, Central Asia now is effectively caught between the promise of Gulf capital and the peril of Iranian geography. Its most viable connectivity route is becoming politically toxic, while alternatives such as Trans-Afghan Corridor or Iraq's development road project remain either unfinished, insecure, or logically ineffective. But there is another option, which is Middle Corridor, which is great promise to the region, but there are also several infrastructure bottlenecks when it comes to that corridor. For now, Iran is remaining the most functional corridor, but it's also most geopolitically precarious. But second dilemma is I would call the Iran dilemma with Russian and Chinese dimensions. You know, this Iran strategic role extends far beyond trade. It's also increasingly aligned with the two most influential powers in Central Asia, Russia and China. So Tehran and Moscow are now engaged in overt military operations. You probably saw some news a couple of days ago. Iran and Russia conducted military operation in the Caspian Sea. Meanwhile, Beijing continues to rely on Iran for energy supplies and considers it as a critical node in its Belt and Road architecture. So, as the West moves to further isolate Iran in support of Israel, Central Asia may face growing pressure from Moscow and Beijing to align closely with Tehran, or at least refrain from joining Western effort to contain it. So this dynamic is already straining regional institutions. For example, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes China, Russia, Iran, and 4 Central Asian countries, is showing clear signs of internal incohesions. I know this organization is not a very coherent organization, but this conflict is dividing this organization more deeply. For example, Pakistan tilts towards Iran rhetorically, but India is supporting allegedly, for example, Israel. So if Iran and Israel conflict escalates, Central Asian states could be pulled into explicit geopolitical alignment they have long resisted, undermining the neutral multi-vector foreign policy posture that has been central to their foreign policy since their independence. So another issue is public sentiment and domestic politics. For example, this also complicates the picture. Central Asian populations are predominantly Muslim, and even though they are governed by secular government, the conflict in Gaza and confrontation with Iran are being watched closely in the region, and increasingly emotionally, people are very emotional when it comes to this conflict. And a May-June 2025 poll conducted by Focus Center showed that in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, 43% of respondents support political alignment with Iran. In Uzbekistan, opposition to such alignment is stronger, but still stronger, and 39% reject it. But as a share of undecided respondents remain significant, especially in Kyrgyzstan, where 25% uncertain. While direct support for military engagement is low, these sentiments carry weight, I guess. If Iran continues to be perceived as a victim of Western or Israeli aggression, governments may come under rhetorical or diplomatic pressure to adjust their positions. This could compromise the careful neutrality they have maintained to date. For example, this concern is not theoretical. In June, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uzbekistan issued a public sentiment, which was very rare. Normally, Uzbekistan express any doesn't make any statement regarding on these issues, but this time they issued a public statement urging citizens to avoid viewing the conflict through ideological or religious lenses and relying on the official sources for information. So to conclude, like Central Asian pursuit of strategic autonomy is not collapsing, but it's under acute and growing strain. So trade corridors are being politicized, and public opinion is becoming more volatile, and multilateral institutions are faltering in their ability to buffer against global fragmentation. Should this conflict deepen or become protracted, it would not only disrupt transit through Iran for Central Asia, but also limit a region's leeway for strategic maneuvering and might force the region into geopolitical choices it has long sought to avoid, which could potentially jeopardize its broader strategic autonomy agenda. Thank you.
Aladdin, thank you very much. That was an excellent table setter, and particularly focused on the impact of this conflict on Central Asia. Let's turn next to our man in the South Caucasus, Damian. What does it look like in Baku, Damian?
Well, let me see if I can first thank you, Andrew, and for having me on, I'm happy to be on this distinguished panel. Maybe I can start with sort of a big picture and then bring it down. None of the countries in the South Caucasus or Central Asia conduct their external relations in the belief that they can, coax foreign leaders into being better and more responsible statesmen, or that they can make the world safe for democracy or for the planet or whatever else, stands at the end of history or is promised to be the outcome of the rules-based liberal order. I think it's important to just reaffirm or reiterate or just remind people of that. Now, Iran and Russia are neighbors to these countries, and this is an unchangeable fact of geography. And Iran and Russia and a couple of other neighbors think of themselves as, post-imperial or civilizational states, which means that they have a tendency, if unchecked, to look around their neighborhoods and see them as belonging to their respective spheres of interest. Now, there's nothing genuinely revisionist about that. Only our European friends and the Biden folks seem to think that this is somehow overcomable, or that it's there's a progression away from that, or that it doesn't apply to them. But in the real world, and especially in this part of the world, no one thinks of diplomacy as a morality play or an exercise in telling the other side how to avoid perdition. Now, For the countries of the South Caucasus and Central Asia, their respective borders are not just lines on the map. And for them, and frankly, for the vast majority of countries in the world, borders remain essential sovereign markers of territorial integrity, and they represent, let's call it the axiomatic basis of each country's identity and sort of definition of itself. So cross-border cooperation, foreign policy, trade, all the rest of it, is ultimately in the service of consolidating these things. Now, what I'm seeing is that for the first time in centuries, and this is sort of my mega trend about this part of the world, the South Caucasus and the Central Asian countries have the opportunity to band together, probably under the leadership of three keystone states, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, and to somehow, in various ways, in fits and starts, this and that, to transform the entire region into sort of a, an autonomous subject of international order instead of remaining an object of great power rivalry. Think of this sort of as ASEAN as the ultimate outcome, but that may be a decade or two away. Maybe that's not the perfect example, but it's the best one I've got. And the way that the countries in this part of the world are going about this differs, right, from country to country. But all of them practice or aspire to practice what can be called independent or multilateral or balanced foreign policy. So through various bilateral and minilateral and multilateral engagements, some of these are formal, some are informal. I'm seeing what Evan Feigenbaum, I think, calls this a policy of extracting more from more, right? The preferred mathematical operations are addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. So let's call this strategic transactionalism. So the overwhelming posture that you see coming out of all the capitals in this part of the world is something like receptivity towards all outsiders. But this doesn't come with a license to interfere or reform or try to transform or impose rules or values or whatever else. Now, this doesn't make them anti-Western, but it does make them non-Western. And my point here is that none of the South Caucasus or Central Asian states are anti-anyone. They're not anti-American, anti-EU, anti-Russian, anti-Iranian, anti-Turkish, anti-Chinese. They're just pro themselves. And they put their own countries first, their own national interests first, as they understand them. And this means, I'm narrowing the scope of what I've been trying to say, this means making sure that your neighbors don't covet you to the point of incorporating you into their sphere of interest, which means making sure no outsider controls your economy and your trade routes, which is ultimately what diversification is about and connectivity. But it also means, having and developing options, strategic options, tactical options. And it means ensuring that no one makes an actual move against you. But it also means making whatever accommodations need to be made with your neighbors so that you avoid rupture, which can increase appetites and covetousness. Now, when one of your neighbors, in this case Iran, suffers a series of setbacks, what can you do? Well, you can go for the jugular, whatever that means, only if you're strong enough to be confident that you can actually, accomplish what you're trying to do. And no country in this part of the world thinks that they're strong enough to go for the Iranian jugular. No one in this part of the world is going to be in the business of going for the jugular or of helping anyone else go for the jugular. I think this is very important to keep in mind. And at the same time, I think everyone in this part of the world understands that Tehran is not going to have the sort of strategic depth that it had before, right? The Iranians like to talk about carpet diplomacy, a careful weaving of influence, through knowledge gathering, relationship building, strategic surprise, right? A multi-layered deterrence strategy, a network of proxies, alliances that are strategic or tactical in nature, dependent partners, sectarian affiliations, parallel investments in missile technology or nuclear ambitions or whatever. And Tehran saw all of this as necessary because of the way that the Islamic Republic looked at the outside world. Now, this deterrence strategy is, well, not what it used to be, to put it mildly. And I think that this is accompanied by some sort of sense of shame, and this shouldn't be underestimated, right? This sense of shame at the popular level could result in a further deterioration of domestic support and maybe some wobbling in terms of internal legitimacy, even more so than we've seen in past instances, but probably not enough to lead to a, let's call it a Maidan scenario. But the point that I want to emphasize here is that you could also see this sort of sense of shame at the level of the new elite that's come up because the Israelis took out, in a set of brilliant tactical operations, many top military leaders and nuclear scientists and all the rest of it. And before that, the Israelis, everybody knows this, had gone after Hezbollah, and Iran's influence in Syria has plummeted, and Hamas is obviously not what it used to be, and the Houthis have been making pragmatic deals and so on. Now, this sense of shame of the people coming up, and obviously of the people who are still there and in the street, is combined with, I think, a renewed sense of strategic loneliness, right? Even more so than during the Iran-Iraq war. Plus, you have this diminishment of deterrence capability. Now, when you put all that together, this suggests to me the growing possibility of more unpredictability in Iranian conduct, both at home and abroad. And this, in turn, suggests the prospect of less compromise and less pragmatism and less moderation, and possibly even less restraint in the way that Iran deals with, one or more of its neighbors. Now, look, the Iranian border is 3 hours away from Baku by car. That's DC to Philadelphia or Brussels to Paris. And it's important to keep this in mind. And I want to now connect this to Israel. Right? Can the countries of the South Caucasus and Central Asia deepen their ties with Israel, or further deepen their ties with Israel in the context of Azerbaijan, in a way that doesn't get the Iranians up in arms sufficiently to do something about it that hurts, given the way that I've tried to explain what I think could be the mood in that country? Well, there's talk of incorporating Azerbaijan and some other countries from this part of the world into the Abraham Accords, right? Articles have been written about this. Even some officials have said some things, some on the record, some off the record. This could happen. But each country in this part of the world would have to find a way to accommodate what is quite likely to be Turkish opposition. Iranian opposition, fine, but also Turkish opposition. And there would also need to be a level of American engagement, a guarantee, or what passes for a guarantee, of sustainable and lasting engagement that no administration has ever been willing to devote to this part of the world. And I think that the Azerbaijani case on this Abraham Accords question could be, or is likely to be, the test case. And please keep in mind that Azerbaijan and Israel have a highly developed strategic relationship that sees no sign of deceleration. Now, I'm saying all of this not to be, skeptical. I'm not. I think there are some opportunities out there. But they really need whoever is in charge of thinking about these things, not just in this part of the world, because, the level of statecraft in Azerbaijan, in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, and maybe in some other countries in the South Caucasus and Central Asia, the level of statecraft is very high. They know what they're doing. They're thinking very rationally. They're putting their own countries first and all that. But people who are thinking about these sorts of interesting ideas and combinations outside of the region, who are championing them or who are against them, need to take very, very seriously some of the questions that I've tried to raise here this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, because there's a level of complexity that is, I think, genuinely underappreciated, at least in some corners of the halls of power in various parts of the world that are not in the South Caucasus or Central Asia. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Damian. Excellent overview and overlay for the broader region, and as well as the South Caucasus and Azerbaijan's specific position. I like your use of the metaphor, carpet weaving. Making a good carpet takes quite a bit of time, and uninterrupted time. I forgot to mention at the outset, of course, that we have a question and answer function, and we will have time for discussion after the initial presentations. And already Ambassador Richard Kozlarich made a comment to Damian, why not include Turkey with Iran and Russia as a neighboring country with objectives in the South Caucasus? Well, I think you did that actually. Maybe not right at the outset. Why don't we move on now to Jim Durso.
Thank you, Andy. The recent 12-day war, the American and Israeli attacks on Iran, which, as Trump said, obliterate its nuclear program, probably hit another target, and that's Central Asia's access to the large Iranian internal market and the use of Iran's transport links to trade with the wider world. Now, Iran in 2005 initiated what they call the Look East policy, which was a way to improve relations with Russia, China, and India to counter Western pressure and sanctions over the nuclear program. And Ahmadinejad's successors actually later expanded the Look East policy to Central Asia. Now, the relations between Iran and Central Asia have been warming of late. One of the most significant and early meetings was in September 2022, when then President Raisi visited Uzbekistan, and they obviously generated many agreements on trade, technology, agriculture, things like that. In March of 2023, the foreign minister met with several Iranian ministers in Tehran, again, more agreements. And in June of 2023, Uzbek President Mirziyoyev traveled to Tehran and met then President Raisi and Iran's supreme leader. And this followed on to Raisi's earlier declaration that improving relations with Central Asia was, he said, quote, one of the first priorities of the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, Iran wants to increase trade with Central Asia. It wants to boost trade with Uzbekistan 4 times to $2 billion. And it wants trade with Kazakhstan and Tajikistan to go to $1 billion each. Now, after the American-Israeli attacks on Iran, President Mirziyoyev ordered a review of the foreign trade and transport routes, emphasizing the need to redirect transport flows to safer ports. But these redirected transfer flows could actually raise logistics costs by 30%. And uncertainty is going to persist as both Netanyahu and Trump have declared that they would attack Iran again if they have any future concerns about the country's uranium enrichment capabilities. Now, in terms of trade with individual countries, other than Uzbekistan, Iran is Turkmenistan's second largest trading partner after Russia, and the two countries want to boost their trade to $3 billion a year. Right now, it's about $600 million. In Turkmenistan, there's a lot of natural gas, and in 2024, Iran and Turkmenistan agreed to build a 125-kilometer natural gas pipeline to deliver initially 10 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Iran. Now, Iran has a lot of natural gas on its own, but it needs about $45 billion a year, or needs about $45 billion in investment to boost gas production. So in the meantime, it's easier just to pipe the stuff in from Turkmenistan. Trade between Kazakhstan and Iran is low. It's about $300 million a year, and they want to certainly improve that. And Iran is attractive to the Central Asian nations because it's a redundant trade route. In June of 2021, Tashkent hosted the leaders of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they announced the formation of a trans-Afghan railway, which would go from the border of Uzbekistan to the seaports of Pakistan on the Arabian Sea. 2 months later, the U.S. and NATO evacuated Afghanistan, the Islamic Republic collapsed, and the Taliban were back in charge, which kind of reiterated the need for obviously a fallback route. Now, Iran is hosting a lot of regional transport routes. There's the International North-South Transport Corridor, which is a 7,200-kilometer multi-mode network from India to Russia. In May, Iran and China launched a railway route from Xi'an in western China to the Alpern Dry Port in Iran's near Tehran. And that'll cut travel from 30 days to 15 days. And more importantly, for China, it'll avoid the choke points at the Malacca Strait and the Strait of Hormuz that the U.S. Navy would typically be counting on to counter Chinese trade in a time of war or tension. Now, Central Asia had wanted to use Iran's ports of Chabahar and Bandar Abbas, although now there's greater risk if there's a chance the U.S. and Israel may attack out of the clear blue sky. And Iran had a lot of attraction to Central Asian countries. It had a large internal market of over 90 million people, and 68% of them were under 35 years of age, which are the prime consuming years. Had a space largely free of violence, unless you don't count the American and Israeli attacks, functioning government agencies, and ports that were adjacent to the markets of India, which is the port of Chabahar, and then the port of Bandar Abbas was adjacent to the Persian Gulf petrostates, which are largely wealthy, high-consuming states. The Central Asian republics also want a partner to deal with instability in Afghanistan, and Iran shares their concerns and has no territorial aspirations in Central Asia, though it would certainly seek political support from the Central Asian republics and for, let's say, the United Nations and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran's position as a transport node makes it a prime target for U.S. and Israeli attacks by both military means and financial means, meaning trade sanctions and financial sanctions. Tel Aviv and Washington are likely concerned that as the Central Asian nations increase their relations with Iran, they're likely going to support Iran in forums such as the United Nations. Also, increased economic activity may benefit the government in Tehran and help preserve its legitimacy. So destabilizing regional supply chains will increase the economic distress of Iranian citizens, hopefully put pressure on the government. And as I said, if Central Asia suffers, that's a sacrifice Washington is willing to make. Now, recently, the governments of Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan kind of indicated they're not willing to be hostages to fate and agreed to a 6-month economic feasibility study of the Trans-Afghan Railway. The deputy transport minister noted that it would be a 5-year project, cost about $5 billion, but it should reduce the delivery time of goods to the Indian Ocean ports from Central Asia from 35 days to 5 days. A lot of funding is going to be required to get this project going. Afghanistan recently joined China's China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, so China may be a source of funds for that. Kazakhstan may contribute $500 million. Qatar and the UAE have interest in the project, and Russia Railways is also going to be involved in the initial preliminary studies on the feasibility. Although Russia Railways has been sanctioned by the US and the EU, so that may complicate their involvement in the project. The NATO-Russia war in Ukraine is grinding to a close. And Russia is probably going to again turn its attention south. In July, Moscow recognized the Taliban government and is the first major government, in fact, the first government period to do so. And that may put pressure on Pakistan and Uzbekistan to recognize the Kabul government, as they are now embarking on a large strategic project that's going to reshape the local economy. So there may make sense at some point for Tashkent and Islamabad to recognize the government in Kabul. Although for Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan are kind of problematic partners, as always. The Taliban leadership and its government is under a mountain of sanctions by the US and the EU. And Kabul, or Afghanistan's capital, may be running out of potable water, since about 80% of the groundwater is contaminated. And construction projects and construction workers require large amounts of water. So while there may be water in the north, in the Amu Darya River, there's no water maybe in the central and the southern parts of the country. So that may certainly impede the project. Also, Pakistan is still a dangerous place, and Chinese foreign minister recently urged Pakistan's army chief to protect the Belt and Road Project and Chinese workers. And this is not the first time he's had to make that request. It seems about once a year, some group of Chinese workers is killed by some group of terrorists or insurgents in either Pakistan or in the Baloch regions. In 2023, Pakistan was unable to withstand U.S. pressure and it dropped out of the Iran-Pakistan natural gas pipeline project and may incur an $18 billion penalty. Now, Pakistan badly needs the energy, and this looked like certainly a good deal, both for the Iranians who could sell their natural gas and not be completely reliant or so reliant on China for hydrocarbon sales. But Pakistan has been suffering from brownouts since forever, and it badly needed the energy. But the U.S. put enough pressure on it, so it folded. So it'll be interesting to see whether Pakistan's leadership, meaning the army, can withstand pressure from the Americans if the U.S. feels it's in its interest to stop this project from completing its last leg through Pakistan to the ports of Karachi. So Central Asia's got a lot of challenges. The Americans' antagonism towards the Taliban, the presence of a sanctioned Russian partner in the project, water shortages in Kabul, Pakistan's violence, and a susceptibility to American pressure may impede the success of the railway. But, Washington and Brussels are always going on about their declared interest in Central Asia's sovereignty and independence. So this will be a chance to make them have their actions match their words. So as I said, it's a lot of uncertainty ahead for Central Asia, and especially for President Mirziyoyev as he certainly tries to steer this project. But it's a signature project, so I think Uzbekistan is going to really lean on this, and they'll certainly be engaged with Washington and Brussels on, basically providing help when necessary through, say, the international development banks like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and otherwise just clearing the way and not getting involved, not letting old grudges against Iran or the Taliban get in the way of Central Asia's economic development. Countries have a large youth population. They need to create jobs. This is certainly one way to do it. So I think Brussels and Washington need to put their money where their mouth is. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Jim. That was a terrific presentation, and definitely very helpful for all of us getting into some of the details of different transit routes and projects in the area. Okay, let's turn to Roger. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Andy, and the folks at the National Interest for putting this together. It's been as I'm listening to the previous presentations, a great discussion really of looking at the various facets of this question, the collateral damage, and how our colleagues and the countries in Central Asia and the South Caucasus are affected by the Israel-Iran conflict. And in particular, I'm going to say I wrote down strategic transactionalism, and I think that's a term of art that we're going to need to employ more and more, because it does go away in explaining how some of these efforts are taking place. What I'm going to try to do in my short time here, and the good news is, going forth, a few things I can skip over and say, largely in agreement with my predecessors, but also to underscore or highlight the so what for the United States. And while I'm not going to be speaking on behalf of the U.S. government or giving, if you will, the official view or some insight that maybe comes from the halls of power, the goal really is to see, well, how is this being viewed by the current administration, and what's the impact on U.S. policy? And I'm going to look really at first three key things for the U.S. Most importantly, we have to go to the, if you want to put quotations around it, the primary concern. And of course, not just the Israel-Iran conflict, but the U.S. participation in, the one-day bombing raid, a significant one, was to help their partner Israel. The United States is really seeing this through the lens of supporting Israel against what is arguably, if not an existential challenge, a strategic challenge in the Middle East. And of course, that's Iran. And when we look at it, it's not just the dynamic between the two states, but the series of proxies throughout, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, etc., the various militias in Iraq. We all know the history of this, and we know that this in many ways has shaped how and why the U.S. Would conduct this operation. Fascinating, just prior to this, of course, you would see the discussions of, the U.S. is going to be unlikely to cross this red line. It wouldn't go into this attack mode. It did. And again, Israel as well is going into uncharted territories. And so we end up, and this gets to the title of this program, the collateral damage. And I think that's a perfect way to phrase it, because we're looking at a limited set of belligerents, but obviously the neighborhood is going to face consequences. And I guess we should say, are these acceptable, collateral damage in the region? Which really leads us to then the second challenge for the U.S. We often don't look at that. Now, I will say, and even though we have this siloed approach to policy, Middle East issues are discussed by Middle East experts. Central and South, Central Asian issues are discussed by Central Asian experts, increasingly being pushed back into the Russian sphere, the Eurasia sphere. South Asia, amongst the South Asians, we tend to have these wonderful stovepipe bureaucracies in the State Department, the Defense Department, the NSC, and quite frankly, even in academia will do this. If you look at the writing of on the Israel-Iran war, it is overwhelmingly from and about the Middle East. We've looked at the consequences and for Lebanon, for Syria, for Yemen, for Iraq, the GCC states. In fact, they have had a prolific set of documents, of speeches, of articles now about the so what? What does all this mean for them? And unfortunately, we in the U.S. tend to divide. We have this wonderful boundary we seem to place north of Iran. And again, as my colleagues have noted here, these are neighbors. There's extensive trade ties. There are personnel ties, if you will, relations amongst the countries. And so we tend not to think of this, and I think sadly we do it at our peril. I will say, and I do caution that this isn't always the case. We can go to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. We can actually go 2 years prior to the Afghan campaign, and no surprise, different departments, ministries, particularly in the intelligence community, would look at, well, what's the impact of this action on these other countries? They could be partners, they could be allies of the U.S. I hope that that's being done today, and I simply phrase it that way. That there are individuals who are looking at what's the impact of U.S. relations with these countries, whether it's trade relations, strategic relations, amongst others. And so this is something, I would say has been a challenge for us. The third, though, and I would call this the unintended consequences, and it's already been highlighted here, and I'm glad it was brought up already, um, is the so-called Abraham Accords accession discussion. And it's fascinating that, of course, with respect to Israel, a central actor in the Middle East, at least in terms of, from the American perspective, a fundamental part of that relationship is expanding, broadening, and deepening the Abraham Accords arrangements. Yes, there are 4 states involved. Yes, other states besides Israel. Yes, other countries are being courted, obviously, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia most significantly. But when you hear rumors and discussions of this could be a component of Armenia, Azerbaijan, arguably post any agreement or treaty between the two. I couldn't imagine this, quite frankly, at present, but were the two to actually formalize what appears to be a rapprochement, or at least an understanding of their bilateral relationship, perhaps even bringing in Turkey, which might address the Turkish opposition, could we see these states become part of a so-called Abraham Accord accession process? It's an interesting mental exercise to think in terms of the plus minuses. Obviously, Israel demonstrating, and this is where the Israel-Iran conflict does play a part, Israel demonstrating its willingness to proactively engage in the region, quite frankly, to put Iran on its back heels, at least for the moment, does make it an interesting partner. Azerbaijan does have fairly good ties with Israel. And let's not forget, Armenia also has relations with Israel, although, again, very complicated. Could we see this develop in this direction? Possible. What I would say, though, again, from an American perspective, were that to happen, unlikely as it might be at the moment, these are the things that would elevate the region in the eyes of the U.S. government, at least this administration. The Abraham Accord is a fundamental element of the U.S. view towards of the Middle East, and having countries engage with it could actually, ironically, elevate them in terms of U.S. perceptions. I would say, though, just as a final comment on that, in any of these discussions, I think for the states in the region to accept this structure, getting rid of things like Jackson-Vanik, Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act, and others might have to play a part. So I throw those out as kind of U.S.-centric elements. Just a couple of other points to raise, and then I'll close. And the first really is on duration and the challenge of what may happen in the future. This war was 12 days. The exchange of missiles, there were casualties, there was damage. Obviously, not just the physical conflict that took place, but the media conflict, the information space battles, etc. We've all followed these. It was one day for the U.S., but a significant one. Again, whether the U.S. actually obliterated the sites or caused severe damage, etc., that damage assessment battle is going to go on, for a while. And that generally is the case when you think in the past of bombing raids and on one level they could be seen as very successful. Then you start to look at well, really, what was the technical damage on the ground, but then also the second and third order effects in terms of relations with other states and perceptions by other states. Iran vowed to respond. They did this interesting telegraphed attack on the U.S. base in Qatar. Is that the end? Probably not. And let's be honest, the Iranians still will feel they need to do something else, even if at present they claim they're done with retaliation. And so what I see is obviously a 12-day conflict that now is in this really uneasy neither peace nor war environment. Could it flare up? Could there be a replay or an intensification of conflict? Absolutely. And obviously, if that were to happen, yes, it would involve Israel, Iran. We can't now rule out, could it again involve the U.S.? And so with all of this, if I'm in Central Asia or the South Caucasus, or if I'm an American looking at these states, again, I'm going to want to judge and gauge the public opinion, as was noted earlier, actions or statements of governments. And I agree with my colleagues here that for the most part, you're going to see abstentions or fairly neutral language, a lack of desire to choose sides. And that's going to be, a set of courses of action that the U.S. would have to accept or understand. So again, the duration issue is going to come in. And yes, if it does reappear as a conflict, as a hot conflict, the very trade issues, the very commercial ties, and other arrangements that have been noted today would be in jeopardy. The second, and this is really more of kind of homework for all, is the international organizations of which these states engage. And again, IOs have been brought up a bit. In particular, I'm curious about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran's a member. A number of Central Asian states are members. The Economic Cooperation Organization, a fairly weak structure, let's be honest, but one that some countries have tried to revive. Turkey is a member, Iran, the states in the Caucasus, Central Asia. Were we to see in these organizations, at their meetings, when they're discussing future arrangements, if they were to go so far as to make political statements on this conflict, and the SCO is the more likely of the two, how do the Central Asian and South Caucasus states react? And I would argue, what's the so what from the U.S. point of view? Do we consider this the price of doing business, or is it something that we would have to follow up and almost hold against countries that sided with their colleague Iran? Because what I would say in this situation, Iran does have a chance to assert itself, maybe to engage with the international community outside of the normal courses of action, we see, whether through proxies or others. But in the diplomatic space, in the economic space, they've been doing this for years. And I think this conflict may embolden them to do that more, which would obviously only heighten tensions in the region, because this is against what Israel and the United States would like. So I throw this out as a, just something to look at, no real answer on that. Andy, I'm going to close here and turn the microphone back over to you, and we can begin our questions and discussion.
Thanks very much, Roger. That was a very interesting set of comments, and thank you very much. Appreciate you bringing in the perspective more of U.S. foreign policy and thoughts about that. Wow. Okay, let's turn to the questions and answers. There's a couple of questions, one from Seamus Duffy and one from Raphael Auclair, asking about the Zangezur corridor down in the Iranian-Armenian border. Seamus writes, do any of the panelists see the Iran-Israel conflict as creating opportunities for the West, particularly in the South Caucasus? I don't think it's coincidental that the recently proposed American-managed Zanzibar corridor, I'm not sure about that, but came in the aftermath of the 12-day war. I'd love to get your thoughts. And Raphael, writing from Paris, hello, everybody. Thanks for this great discussion. What do the panelists think about the Zangezur corridor project? What is the chance for it to get done? Also, yesterday, senior foreign policy advisor to the leader of the Islamic Revolution stated this project is a threat to Iran. Do you think Iran is in a capacity to prevent this deal between U.S., Armenia, and Azerbaijan to be made? Damian, why don't we go to you first and turn to others if they have some thoughts on this.
Thank you. All right. First, let's just understand each other. When we talk about Armenia and Iran, let's not forget that these two countries are allies. This is one of the closest relationships in this part of the world, and it's uncomfortable for people who, or at least for some people, to always have that in the back of their minds. Second, look, the Zangezur corridor idea, which is this idea of sort of creating or reconstituting a rail line and perhaps a road link between what's called mainland Azerbaijan and its Nakhchivan exclave is something that was born of the document that put an end to the Second Karabakh War. It is not an integral part of the peace process, or that is to say, of the text that has been agreed between Azerbaijan and Armenia, but that needs to be signed for reasons that we don't have time to get into. But it's clearly a topic that's on the table. There have been various leaks that have come out talking about various American ideas or American proposed ideas for how this corridor could function. Azerbaijan has been very clear on what would work for Azerbaijan and what Armenia would need to do in order for that to happen. One of the ideas that was put out there was to have sort of a third-party private entity that in one way or another would be backed by the United States to administer some of the customs and border controls regimes. All of this is still up in the air. There has been really no even acknowledgement in any serious sense by anybody involved in the discussion with regards to any of the details. And so we get into a level of speculation that might not necessarily be conducive to moving the discussion forward. It's just that we simply don't know, or at least there's not enough public information out there to have, a serious conversation about it. The Iranian comments, as far as I understand, were specifically geared to sort of what they understood as being the American proposal. The Iranians have always been of the opinion that extra regional actors should not increase the scope of their geopolitical and geoeconomic activity in this part of the world. I think that it would be fair to say that Azerbaijan would not enter into any kind of an arrangement that would that would lead to a rupture with Iran, particularly in the context of Zangezur, but also Russia, which means that some kind of accommodations would need to be made both by Yerevan and Baku to the concerns that both Tehran and Moscow see as being legitimate. How that would go about specifically in the context of this American proposal that we don't know enough about, I genuinely would not be able to say anything about. But clearly, I think it would be foolish to believe that any kind of an arrangement would be acceptable to Baku and Yerevan and Ankara and some of the Central Asian states and so on, if it were if there would be a sufficiently high level of concern expressed by Tehran or Moscow. And anybody who doesn't understand that, I think, just shouldn't be thinking in a serious way about this part of the world, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I don't mean to be flip, but I think that that's genuinely important to keep in mind. These are neighbors. It's a fact of geography. I said this earlier. I'm not going to repeat what I said. If I may, Andrew, quickly, this comment by Khadija, very, very quickly.
Yeah.
The way that any of the countries in this part of the world, starting with the Keystone states, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, but the others also, can increase the likelihood that they can be successful in the conduct of what they call an independent or a multivectoral or whatever you want, a balanced foreign policy, is to actually do it properly. In other words, to invite everybody in, because that's the only way that you can ensure that you don't have to make a choice to opt for one or another or a third. And if you're prudent enough in the way that you conceive and conduct your foreign policy, and you can get everybody else in more or less on the same page from this part of the world, then you can successfully push back. By push back, I don't mean push out. Pushing out is not possible. But push back sufficiently so that you increase the scope of, let's say, your ability to engage in autonomous decision making. And that would really be the first time, if this is done properly and if somehow it gets institutionalized over time, this would be the first time in centuries that you'd have this part of the world that would be as close to being an independent, what's the term? It's not pole, but an independent pillar in the international actor in the international system. That would really be that would be game changing, and I think that really is what everybody is strategically aiming for.
Thanks, Damian, and thanks also for addressing Khadijah's question. Her comment question really cuts to the central tension of this discussion, which all of you have been raising in various ways. For Central Asian states, they are all landlocked. Uzbekistan is double landlocked. They are surrounded by some very large nation states, Iran, Pakistan, and then, of course, China, Russia. And then there's Afghanistan, which we've also put various sanctions on. And from the standpoint of U.S. policy, it seems that, while I think both James and Roger alluded to this, that yes, in principle, we support the sovereignty of the states of the South Caucasus and Central Asia. But in fact, when those goals come into conflict with larger and more significant strategic goals of the United States, they fall by the wayside. And of course, we've seen that with the sanctioning of the Russian Federation for now 11 years, and especially in the last 3 years with the Ukraine war, Iran, Afghanistan. So where it's a fundamental kind of contradiction for all of these smaller states that reminds me of in 2014 when Russia first made the move into Crimea. The satirical publication The Onion made a fake a satirical announcement by the State Department, an advisory advising the small states surrounding Russia to move. Well, yeah, it's funny, but it's obviously it does put the finger on that point. I wondered if our other speakers, Jim, Roger, Loudon, could comment on what Damian has suggested. Increase. We certainly see this with the Central Asian states over the last few years, where they've been acting in a more coordinated way. Um, uh, what do you see as the potential for this South Caucasus, Central Asian um, grouping, and possibly including other contiguous larger states, Iran, Turkey, and others? Loudon, why don't we turn to you first? Although I see Jim raising his hand. Loudon, why don't you go ahead?
Sorry. So the one thing is like here, as Damian mentioned, Central Asian countries, they are very worried about this interference of bigger powers. So like now, like if you see Central Asia and that there is this knowledge of Turkic countries, Turkic integration, but I wouldn't like really support like strongly this kind of ideas. But in case of Central Asian, it's mostly about pragmatic. So then when it comes to, for example, involving Turkey, that yes, it's important for Central Asia also like to diversify their foreign policy to get more partners, but overall they do not want to give anyone this exclusive access to the market or the economy, because they even though like Turkey is very close us and we have special relationship with Turkey, but still the common this knowledge here is we should keep balance among all these big powers, especially our neighbors. For example, in case of like Azerbaijan, even though like Azerbaijan is not located in Central Asia, but we see as a part of Central Asia because of this culture, language, and we have also like especially Uzbekistan shares lots of commonalities when it comes to the international relations, foreign policy, and this relationship with other like neighboring countries. Yeah, this is my comment.
Thanks, Loudon. Jim.
Okay, well, I think the Central Asian republics are kind of, looking back, I mean, for hundreds of years, they were part of, the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Empire, and then really, I guess you could even say the American Empire for the time the U.S. was in Afghanistan, because it used Uzbekistan's air bases early in the conflict. The Northern Distribution Network ran through, started at Poti in Georgia, and then ran through Russia, then Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and then the U.S. used the air base at Manas in Kyrgyz Republic for as a transshipment point and a major refueling point. And in fact, the U.S. government fuel contracts, I think, were the cause of two governments falling there. So I think now they just want to be free and clear of everybody. They want to be friends with everyone. And I guess Kazakhstan was the first to kind of announce a multi-vector foreign policy back when I guess Uzbekistan was still fairly inward looking. But now I think that's probably become the the operative philosophy of all the governments. And they want to be open to trade with everyone, and they just don't want to be part of anybody's bloc anymore. Although I think the US would probably have more of a problem with them not. I think China, Turkey, Russia, Iran may take 50% of something rather than 100% of nothing. But I think Washington is still in the, you're either with us or with the terrorist mindset, and isn't willing to take anything less than, a Catholic marriage, basically, with any of the countries. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Appreciate the allusion to the Catholic Church. Roger.
Yeah, Andy, just a kind of a quick follow-up, and then on Zangezur, getting back to that is on paper, and if you're thinking in terms of economic efficiencies, there actually is value in it if it's done right. Now, that's obviously a number of ifs, right? Because if we're looking at a true east-west trade corridor through the Caucasus, connecting Central Asia, the Caucasus, and beyond, having multiple routes through the South Caucasus would be beneficial. And obviously, a precondition for this is normalizing relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Armenia and Turkey. That's a game changer. I mean, that's actually take a step back and you realize we're now, experiencing something we haven't seen in over 30 years. And so there's definitely pluses in that. And it's not just the US that would support it. Obviously, the European Union is investing money in it. And so there are outside actors. I would caution because, of course, the countries in the region, and this just goes back to a comment earlier made, aren't keen to have another elder brother come in and dictate terms. And so this does have to be finessed in a different way. It has to be beneficial for the actors in the region. All sorts of studies show that right now, yeah, it has to get to a point of better economic efficiencies. We're not there yet. It could happen. And if that's when that happens, okay, great for the region. But interesting on the role of the outside actors, and just a very quick comment, it could be done without the consent of Iran. Iran could be blocked out of this. And while there's definite concern, Iranian interests in the region, we've already seen, Iran's influence in the region diminish. After the Karabakh Wars, Iran's ability, particularly in the illicit goods transfers through the ungoverned spaces and through, Karabakh and others, that disappears. Their inability to transit, legally through the region has been limited a bit. But we're finding that their political sway is much less. And so I actually could see this as a project that would develop, getting to the questions. And just as a last point, even the actual 12-day war, so to speak, when we look at the role of outside powers, Russia ultimately did nothing. China did nothing. They could utter words, they could voice their opinion, but they weren't factors. And so sometimes, and I think in the region, they see this, actions can happen, and some of the larger powers may be blocked out. So that would be an interesting development to take place. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, it was quite interesting that 2 days after the U.S. bombing of the enrichment facilities, the Iranian ambassador was in Moscow, but the statements from the Russians were remarkably passive, I guess, about what had just taken place. We have another question coming from a student of mine at SAIS last year, Harry Optimos. He's wondering whether the panelists had any insights on the role of the Gulf states in the region. How are states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia perceived in Central Asia lately? There was some discussion of the Gulf states, but Loudon, why don't you take a shot at that?
Yeah, thank you for your
Sorry,
question.
is this a rising stock or a falling stock? The role and influence of the Gulf states.
So if we talk about this Gulf states, if you talk with policymakers, they're very excited with working on this Gulf states, because if you see numbers, the amount of investment is almost equal to Chinese investment, so that they are very eager to invest Central Asian market, especially in agribusiness and in renewable energy. For example, this is Saudi companies like Aqua Power and Mazda are investing a lot. But if we talk about like perception of people, there were some studies by the Central Asia Barometer, but most of Central Asian people do not have much opinion about this Gulf countries. That they most social perception is that these countries are quite rich countries, money countries, but at the same time very hot countries. But at the same time, lots of people do not feel like commonality, or I don't know, like closeness with each other, despite the fact we all like considered Muslim countries, but most of Central Asian countries are secular countries. They are not Islamic countries. So, but in terms of politics, in terms of business opportunities, I think like most of Central Asian countries are excited to work with Gulf countries, especially like when it comes to Trans-Afghan corridor, for example. And UAE and Qatar also expressed their interest in investing in this corridor and other projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Aladdin. Okay, I'm going to add one more question myself, and then give a final round to the panelists to address the question and make any other final comments that they would like to, as we are running out of time. I've been kind of on an India kick recently. I read the new book by Clay Dalrymple, The Golden Road, about the ties between India and through this region to the West. Fascinating book, and then also reading right now his book, The Anarchy, about the conflict essentially between the British East India Company and India then. We haven't had much discussion of India, but certainly Central Asia is well, they've helped to finance the port of Chabahar, other infrastructure projects helping to connect Iran with Central Asia. They're a big advocate, of course, of the international north-south transit corridor. What have we heard much from India in response, or how would you view India's perspective on the larger question that we're facing today? Who wants to go first? Okay, Jim, you're up.
Well, is India going to be interested in investing in the area, I guess you'd say, more for its own sake economically, or is it just going to be a way to block Pakistan? Just as, Pakistan accused India's interest in Afghanistan as a way to kind of end run Pakistan's need for strategic depth. And is even just regular commerce going to be viewed by Pakistan as an Indian attempt to end run them? I don't know enough about India or Pakistan, but that may be something that's going through their heads in Pakistan. If they see more Indian businessmen or trade delegations, or even worse from Pakistan's eyes, a state visit would probably be a catastrophe as far as Islamabad's concerned. But, are they going to be now investing, as I said, for, I guess, the economic zone's sake, or are they going to be looking at it more as a strategic move?
I guess the wise rabbi response to the way you formulated it, are they doing this as a way to block Pakistan, or is it simply part of their economic and strategic interests? It would seem to be possibly both. Damian, let's turn to you.
Maybe quick on this. There's a Turkey, Azerbaijan, Pakistan trilateral relationship that clearly pushes up against Indian ambitions. Not so much in Central Asia, but in sort of from going from Central Asia to the South Caucasus to Anatolia and beyond. This is complicated. Both Pakistan and India look at these at sort of Azerbaijan's and Turkey's preferences or rhetorical and concrete steps as sort of zero sum, vice versa for some of the countries that have gone onto the Indian bandwagon, most particularly in this part of the world, Armenia. That is going to limit, I think, India's ability to project its influence and but also to sort of be a serious player, because if you want to go from Central Asia to Europe along a land corridor, you have to go through the South Caucasus, and unless you want to go through Russia and Iran, and that means that you've got to find some way of dealing with Azerbaijan and beyond that Turkey. And I think that's not in the cards at the moment. Roger said something earlier about was it stovepipe bureaucracies or silos or whatever. That is, I think that's not just an American problem, it's an EU problem as well. It's a Western problem. Everybody is used to looking at, the South Caucasus somehow belongs to Europe. Central Asia belongs to whatever. The Middle East is a third. This is the level of interconnectedness, to come back to one of the questions, between these parts of the world, irrespective of popular opinion, because Aludin related to this, said something about this. But I think that strategically, the people who matter, who make decisions in this part of the world, have a very different view of the closeness of of the ties, of the historical record, but also of the strategic opportunities with regards to the Gulf countries and Iran. And that's something I think that that too many people in too many parts of the West, in Brussels and DC and elsewhere, although I think in DC it's changing for the better, don't get this. And that's, opportunities will be missed. I talked about Azerbaijan as a test case in the context of Israel. Maybe the Zangezur corridor can be a test case in the context of sort of the sophistication that is or isn't there in Washington now with regards to looking at sort of the big picture and understanding the connections between the South Caucasus and the Middle East and Central Asia and so on.
Thanks, Damian. Always appreciate historical perspectives and geographical perspectives. Roger.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep it brief. Just quickly on India. Yeah, good you brought this up because one, there is definitely an Indian interest in the region, not just in their policy circles, their external affairs, etc., but in their academic community. In fact, there's some good Indian scholars right now visiting in the U.S. Who work on Central Asia, and happy to connect them with you. But because there's a sense it's the historic ties, it's the cultural ties. They can go back in terms of connections India has with this broader region. Again, getting back to Damian's view of let's transcend our specific zones of the world. But there is also a strategic interest. And if India sees itself as a major player in the world, I don't want to say great power, but as a significant actor in the world that can project power, economic, military, cultural, etc., Central Asia could play a role. It also may play a role in its challenges with China. But, and this is going back to the topic at hand, Iran being weakened or isolated further from the region, if that's one of the results of this conflict, hurts India because all these north-south trade routes, absolutely right, they can't go through Afghanistan or Pakistan right now, but they can go through Iran. And if that route is blocked, that only hurts India's ability to engage with Central Asia and the South Caucasus. By the way, similar to an extent for the Gulf states, and I see, at least, working with a number of Gulf states, there is an interest in Central Asia. And there's kind of two quick data points that I'll close. Increasing number of Central Asian workers in the Gulf countries. They see, quite frankly, if you're a Central Asian, you want to, become an expat and send remittances home. Do you go to Russia? Do you maybe go to Oman? I'm going to put my money on going to Oman. I think you're going to get treated better. And you may even have a higher salary. So, there are some interesting waves in that direction. Secondly, education, particularly American campuses that have or satellite or branch campuses in the Gulf states, NYU, Georgetown, among others. Central Asian students are attending these. They get to go to an American school, but mom and dad are happy that their kid is only a flight away from home. And it's probably less expensive to send them there. Very practical reason, but you're seeing Central Asians being educated in the Gulf, which is a fascinating development. Now, will these ties expand to something beyond? We'll see. But again, some interesting data points. Back to you.
Thanks, Roger. And always great to bring in the higher education angle. I'm a big fan of that. Okay, Alaudin, the last word is yours, except for mine, of course.
Regarding India, I think India enjoys comparatively neutral perception in Central Asia. But again, like when we talk about this international relations or like all these C5 plus formats, we don't hear much about India. We have now 12 programs, but we don't have any program with India. At the same time, I think like Indian presence in Central Asian markets are comparatively less than other neighboring countries. But at the same time, India can be a bit challenge for Central Asia when it comes to transport corridors. For example, when I visited Pakistan in February, when I talked about uh, this trans-Afghan corridors and like getting access to South Asian markets, like most Pakistani people, they are very sensitive when we say like Indian market. They see, I think, like relationships between Pakistan and Central Asian countries will be shaped to certain extent by the influence of Indian factor. So like when we talk about also this trade routes, so they are also competing with Iranian Chabahar and Bandar Abbas ports, and they are also kind of encouraging Central Asian countries to use these ports Karachi and Gwadar, and they have also another idea. For example, now China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan started construction of railways, and they are also encouraging us like to use CPEC program, like which travels from Andijan and Kyrgyzstan, and then it reaches China, and then from Chinese Kashgar city it travels to the Pakistani uh, cities. So I think like in case of Central Asian countries, their position is we are happy to engage with each and everyone, but at the same time we don't ally with anyone. So like when there is delegation coming from Pakistan, and then if our delegation to goes Pakistan, and then we will intentionally send another delegation to India to show that we are neutral, we are not like against anyone. This is I would say common mentality here in Uzbekistan or any other Central Asian countries.
Thank you very much, Aladdin. This is an excellent point to conclude on. Um, Thank you very much, Jim, Damyan, Roger, Aladdin, for all of your insights and thoughtful interjections today. I want to thank our audience abroad for participating and providing a lot of interesting questions and comments. And last and very much not least, I want to thank my colleague, truly the indispensable person at the Center for the National Interest, Jordan Henry, who makes everything work at the center, including this online event today. We're going to take a little summer break now, and we'll be back with you in September. So I wish you all the very best, and let's try to stay cool to the extent that we can. Thanks all, and see you in the fall. Bye bye.